Hello and welcome to the 216th episode of From Alpha to Omega. Today is Monday the 12th of May 2025 and I'm your host Tom O'Brien. This week we continue our discussion with Roger Arevalo about the Vanguard method, the brainchild of the British management consultant John Seddon. Next week I'll be giving a talk at the inaugural Complex Anarchism Symposium in Brussels about unifying value theory in cybernetics. This looks like it's going to be a really interesting event. I've included a link in the show notes for anybody who wants to find out more and maybe meeting up with us there. This episode I have the new patrons Victor Trenchard and Anna to thank. If you'd like to help support the show, please head on over to the Patreon and fire me a few commie dollar. And if you don't have any money, why not give the show a like or making a comment if you're listening on YouTube, or leave a review on your podcatcher of choice. Let's juice those algorithms. And if you'd like to support the book project that Don and myself are working on, head on over to theclasslesssocietyinmotion.com. We really couldn't do this project without your help. Okay, to the discussion.
One thing in John Seddon's work is his IT minimalism, which is like, if you can do something without computers first, do it completely manual just to truly understand it. If you can't turn the computers off, don't mess with them, but think of them as a constraint, as a potential problem you may need to get rid of. And that is such a radical difference from the, sort of throw computers at everything solution. But I will say there are some things that IT minimalism has its limits. So if you're doing stuff like credit card processing or computer game development, you're in the computer business, whether you like it or not, and there is no getting away from them in those fields.
Yeah, no, it was interesting because this is an aside now, but we were on we were listening to a talk, I think, a few months ago, and you were asking a question to the panel afterwards about socialist planning, and you said, could you do any of this without a computer? And it was a brilliant point, because the essence of socialism is not, microchips, it's social relations. And they're the things that you need to figure out, not computer algorithms.
With the way so many socialist planning writers have this sort of obsession and enthusiasm for computers, we need to remember what percentage of big computer projects either fail completely or fall massively below what their original plans were. And there's one for the computerization of the London Stock Exchange called Taurus, which among management people and computer people is a notorious horror story. And a big part of the reason that went down was they didn't optimize the manual system first. They just tried to go to this perfect theoretical computer system, and it was a disaster. And, I just have this vision of, if we actually attempt the great socialist computer, all we're going to end up with is a computer that just keeps saying, you require more Vespine gas. If anybody who wasn't into computer games during that period, it's from a famous real-time strategy game, which is a game where you have to harvest resources and use it to build your base and your army. And one of the key critical sort of bottleneck resources was a thing called Vespine gas. And it was always the thing that would fall short first. So it just drove people mad hearing over and over again, you require more Vespine gas.
What game is this, Roger?
I think StarCraft 2. I never played it myself. It's just one of those legendary sort of things you see on TV tropes. Or from, I think it was Dune 2, construct more pylons. Because pylons were one of the main parts of the productive infrastructure or something.
I know it's interesting because I have an example for you from work I used to do. We used to do work for data analytics stuff for Sainsbury's, and they got, I think it was KPMG, to build this market management, campaign management software thing, and it was such a disaster that they spent millions and millions. I had to use it. I'd have to input some data into it, and it would take about 2 hours to upload a file and put a tag on it. And it was just the most incredibly badly designed. my instructions were, you couldn't figure out how to do it from like intuitively. My instructions were like, click on the 5th tab, and then in this 6th sub tab, go into that, and then press put this text in this box. And it was just incredible trying to do a very simple task, to the extent it was so bad that KPMG had just had their new headquarters in London built. I think it was KPMG anyway, in Holborn by Norman Foster, the guy who did the Gherkin. So a really prestige, big ass building, like 10-story, massive, very nice building. And the piece of software was so bad that Sainsbury's sued them, and KPMG gave them their new headquarters in exchange. And that's why Sainsbury's is actually in Holborn. Like that's why their headquarters is there. It wasn't supposed to be them at all. That's what I was told.
Oh,
anyway.
Yeah, that is one of those. Yeah, that is one of those things you see over and over again. The posher a computer program looks, the worse it is. Like, when we were doing a lot of DIY, like in the house and garden, we'd order a lot of stuff from both Wix and B&Q. And the B&Q computer terminal, like the in-store computer terminal, had this kind of fairly pretty visual display, but it was a nightmare. It just had all these required fields, and it was awful. And like, I don't think anybody there knew how to work it properly, or maybe it's impossible to work it properly. But at Wix, it just looked like DOS. It was just like black screen, white text. But there was this woman manager there who really knew what she was doing, and just like typing a few lines, right, all your stuff's ordered, it'll be delivered in a few days kind of thing.
So Seddon, like the TPS, he puts a big emphasis on not rewarding the individual productivity of the worker, largely because the individual productivity is usually a function of the system itself and not the individual worker. This, I think is not the totality of it, but it says something very important for how about an egalitarian socialist society could work. That this individual recognition of productivities, even in a capitalist system, it's a negative.
Yeah, there's an interesting bit of a debate on this that I've heard in the Vanguard world, to do with paying salesmen on commission. And obviously, under the Vanguard method, paying people on individual commission is obviously terrible. It's just going to reward people for learning how to game the system. But two other alternatives to that is, one, no commission at all, just straight salaried employees. And it's just, you're both being paid to do your job and figure out ways to improve the job. It's an appeal to professional pride kind of thing. The other way of doing it is collective commission. And with salesmen, that created a really interesting dynamic, because then instead of them being rivals, like the high-performing salesman just sort of lording it over the low-performing salesman and sort of almost enjoying their failures, it creates a situation where, if this person's not up to it, you make them good and you'll benefit as well. It creates this alternate motivation to make sure everybody's as good as they can be, because then everybody will benefit from it.
But, even from a socialist point of view, one would say that, increasing sales is not even a desired quality.
Yeah, that... I don't know. When I was in the SWP, increasing sales of socialist worker was always a desired quality. The basic principle kind of stands across other fields as well, in the sense of when it benefits you to help other people improve.
So, how do you see this stuff helping, say, revolutionary organization?
Yeah, this is the interesting bit about it. Once you learn the Vanguard method and other sort of management consultant stuff, you start seeing opportunities to apply it in all sorts of interesting little ways. I knew it had sunk into my head when I found out, when I started thinking through the most efficient ways to shave and cut my nails, And this is the thing, I started thinking about how revolutionaries, how we'd run industries after the revolution, based on the logic of, if you're going to seize the means of production, you need to know what you do with it afterwards. But the interesting thing is, like, reading about stuff in the Russian Revolution, I started seeing opportunities like this is fairly advanced, like once revolution is in progress. And it was like what's going on at the Smolny Institute, where both like Bolshevik headquarters and the Soviet is sitting, became the hub of the revolution. And various books I've read about it tell all these stories about what sort of things, what sort of business was transacted there. Well, not really business, but sort of matters to attend to. And all these people coming and going. And it's like somebody comes in to report important information. Somebody else comes in to ask for help with a certain thing. Other things is like coming in over the telegraph, like trouble's broken out over here, send armored cars. And all of this can be just studied by Vanguard method. You could have the capability chart of how long it takes to deploy armored cars to an incident, or how long it takes you to solve the problem of the person who comes in, or once an important report comes in, how long does it take to distribute it to the people who need to know that. And you could have it all breaks down into value demand, failure demand, type and frequency of demand. How well are we satisfying the needs of the people who are coming to us? And it's like, there's this great story I got to tell about Tales from the Smolny. This guy who'd been living in Europe, came back just in time for the revolution. And he went into the Smolny and was just wandering around, just looking at what this new center of power looks like. And he looks into one room and he sees some people he recognizes, some people he knows. And one of them is just laid on this settee with a sign on the wall above it that says Minister of Finance. And they got talking and reminiscing, and he made the mistake of admitting that while he'd been living in Europe, he'd worked in a bank. Pretty soon he was on the sofa. They were so desperate for anybody with any skill level in these kind of areas. Just a guy who would be like a teller in a bank is now Minister of Finance, because that's the most qualified person they could get.
The capability measure stuff, it's very interesting. And I think also this idea of, from the customer point of view, the Seddon always talks about the capability measures should be like point of view of the system from the customer's point of view. And that revolutionary organizations or Marxist organizations, whatever, have to have that point of view, as in, like, it should be proletarian focus and not, command and control focus, which is completely endemic and completely, as dysfunctional as Whitehall targets.
Yeah, this does get us into some slightly different territory from what a service organization will be, because as revolutionary organizations, we are kind of a push, at least partially a push organization. We can't just until the last few days before the revolution, it's not just a case of people coming to us telling us we would like some revolution, please deliver it for us, kind of thing. We do have a persuasion role. If you're in a role where you're trying to persuade people of something or make them think a certain way, or I guess in kind of a way similar to an educational organization as well, in the sense that people may come to an educational organization knowing they want to be educated, but respecting your knowledge to educate them. If you're saying you give lessons on this, you are making the claim that you know this better than they do. So there is an element of push mode compared to pull when you're doing this. But there is also the massive amount of pull, maybe that's the wrong terminology to do this, but interestingly, this is a question that sort of missionaries face as well. How much you push your religion onto other people, and how much you do the sort of service part of, just meeting them where they are, serving their needs as they see them. And this gets kind of away from, let's say, the management consulting bit, and more into sort of humanistic psychotherapy, stuff like motivational interviewing, and a lot of stuff from fields as diverse as like adult education to stuff like hostage negotiation and cult deprogramming. It all kind of converges. They have this attitude of how you approach people. Well, on one hand, you are meeting them where they're at, like respecting their autonomy and their ability to make decisions and choose for themselves. And I guess, sort of like respecting their ability to disagree, at least like to a point. But then when you are trying to convince them of certain things and encourage them to act certain ways or build up their confidence in themselves to act for themselves, there's, stuff about like ethical persuasion and influence and leadership. And there's a whole nother interesting debate I think for the left to have about how we relate to that. And, just as I push these books by Seddon, I think, we should read a lot of stuff about coaching, motivational interviewing, therapy kind of topics to see how these different groups manage the kind of interpersonal relationship aspect with people. I've actually talked about this with John Seddon about how these other things fit in, and also with like crew resource management and human factors sort of stuff, elements of like how you do briefings, debriefings, communicate under high stress situations, understanding of how stress and fatigue affects people, the stuff from airlines, dangerous industries, the emergency services. When I talk about this with John Seddon, because of his niche is sort of just improving service organizations, he reckons a lot of that sort of stuff is just not necessary. You just follow the Vanguard method and everything will be fine. But I reckon in the sort of extreme complexity, high risk environment, and also like the extreme emotional complexities of what revolutionaries do, we do ourselves a big favor looking at that field as well. And I think it does fit in well with Vanguard method and other management consulting type topics.
I was just thinking when you were chatting there, if we think of just even Toyota, for example, they are mixes of push and pull, as in their marketing department. It's not all just pull from the customer. They go and they market, and so they have push elements too. Now, some might say that, a true pull organization, the demand for the new products should come from the consumer and all that. But, in capitalism, there still is the push element. And so
you do have to at least let the potential customer know your product exists.
Right. That will be true of any revolutionary Marxist, socialist, whatever we want to call it, organization. That even though I think it has to fundamentally be non-alienating, where I think a lot of the current like SWP type, Leninist type parties tend to be very command and control and are alienating. I think they chew up their activists, to be honest with you. Now, I've never been through one. Maybe you would have some stories that way. But when it comes to I think a kind of a holistic and systemic approach to a revolutionary organization, it would have to be based on these kind of at least huge amounts of it would have to be based on these kind of pull components that we see here in Seddon theorizing about.
Yeah, like I talked about once we got to the Smolny stage, but before that as well, there is a great deal of the Vanguard method that works in revolutionary or would work in revolutionary organizations, just in one sense, just as them being an organization in basic stuff like recruitment and, onboarding new members and just making sure, another thing from the party days, making sure all the subs work properly. But also this sort of study and analytical stuff of the frontline work, I guess to revolutionaries, that would just be going to see where people are at and where we can help them. Whether that is in, as it's normally described, where the struggle is kind of thing. But that's not all of it. That's obviously a massive part of it, and that's where we kind of want to be, supporting them as much as we can. But there is also the other thing of maybe what they need is more an advice sort of thing. Like if they're having trouble with certain things, and you can guide them through some problem they're having that may actually have a solution, which may just be, dealing with a landlord or some government bureaucracy or something. And to truly, sort of get down into the meat of what the struggles of people are, and that have the same sort of analytical structure Vanguard method uses. And that would help us both do what, kind of in general, do what we're supposed to be doing as socialists, but also like build relationships with people, build trust and rapport with the people we're trying to reach, which will be a different angle, I think, from a lot of the ways socialists generally approach people. And also another mid-range application of the Vanguard method to our stuff is it's so obviously a good fit for, say, like back in the miners' strike or another mass strike, and sort of organizing all your flying pickets and your campaign to close down industries after, one after another. And you can just imagine that same level of analysis to be in the sort of flying picket control room, and you've got the big board up with, the sort of industrial flow chart of where products and materials go and what you need to shut down for maximum effect, and like keep track of like how militant and how much solidarity you're likely to get from different groups of workers, and just gathering all your reports from when your flying pickets come back. You can just see it working on that level of organization as well.
Weirdly, I only found out, I think this week, that that song that was number one in the 80s by the Flying Pickets, that it was to do with the miner strike. Do you remember that song? All I Need Is You or something?
I don't know about that. The only 80s songs I remember about to do with the miner strike, I think, were from the Style Council. And since we're talking miner strike, another thing that the Vanguard method analysis could help you with, you're familiar with, like in the miner strike, all the different theories about what Orgreave was. I mean, obviously, it's, not physically what it was. Obviously, it's a coking plant. But like, there's at least 3 different stories about the nature of Orgreave and its relation to the strike. One is that it was like this massive missed opportunity that, like, just all forces that could possibly have been mobilized should have just been sent to descend on Orgreave and shut it down and make that the decisive battle, like Saltley was in 72. One version of the theory was, even after they got savagely beaten by the police, like the big Sheffield factories aren't that far away. And like, even after they'd been beaten on the front line, another thing they could have done was just go into these big plants in Sheffield, bleeding everywhere, and just demand solidarity from the engineering workers. Like, look what they've done to us. This is the moment of decision. Will you join us, kind of thing. That's one take on the Orgreave. Another is the baited hook. The Orgreave was a distraction that the police set up to corral the miners and beat them in a set-piece battle. And they really should have carried on concentrating on the Nottingham coalfield. And then a third is from David Douglas's articles in the Weekly Worker and his 3-part autobiography, Stardust and Coal Dust, which has a massive chunk on the miners' strike. And that is, not only was Orgreave a distraction from Nottingham, but Nottingham was a distraction from the real targets, which should have been the power stations and the wharves and maybe the oil refineries, because they were the true critical point that everything was hanging on, but they just didn't realize it at the time. And he also says that the only reason coke moving out of Orgreave was an issue was because the miners had an agreement with the Scunthorpe steelworkers to just supply enough coke to not make any steel, but to stop the blast furnaces from collapsing. But for some reason, Arthur Scargill reneged on that deal for just totally unclear reasons. And then they had to start moving coke, like scab coke, out of Orgreave. And then the only reason it was scab coke was because Scargill had screwed up this arrangement for whatever reason, which is a very different interpretation of what happened during the strike. But the point is that the sort of Vanguard method way of analyzing, organizations and systems may have given the miners the tools to keep an eye on this sort of stuff, see the way things were going, and maybe make different decisions.
For revolutionary purposes, we have so much information. We have the ability to create good software with good design, cheaply, distributed, decentralized to the extent it needs to be, and centralized to the extent it needs to be, proper cybernetic principles. That there's so much good stuff out there. And the best place we should look for any of this stuff is to how capitalism organizes itself, with obviously a kind of socialist approach to it. But, we should be learning from the top organizational forms of capitalism.
An interesting thing about Vanguard method and surrounding stuff like Toyota Production System and Deming's work. Also interesting one, the Mary and Tom Poppendieck's Lean Software Development trilogy, which is these principles applied to computers. Big computer projects, computer programming and such like, which is also interesting, is how much what they tell you to do is so different from what almost all the other sort of socialist planning literature says to do. One of the other things that is such a massive fear among revolutionaries, and justifiably so, is all the ways, at one time I think they were called toadies and scoundrels, find ways to infiltrate revolutionary organizations and corrupt them from inside. But I think one of the great things about the Vanguard method is it doesn't give bullies and bureaucrats anywhere they can dig in and fester.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because it would emerge in the capability measures and the charts, and you'd see the nature of the work is doing something that's not desired, and it just gets expunged.
Yeah, because it has where the attitude of solving the customer's problem is so forefront, and where management are expected to be in the front line and committed to that, and where the workers are expected to be treated with respect, and to form part of the planning to how to solve the customer's problems. All of that just doesn't give the sort, whether you're talking about the paperwork kind of bureaucrat, the bombastic bully, and the time server, the seat warmer, and all their sort of hangers-on minions and sycophants. It just exposes them to the light of day.
Like the vampire and the sunlight.
Part of why I was so enthusiastic about this is I have read all, not quite all, but like a big chunk of all the other socialist planning books, and it's just overwhelming how bad it is. It's like, and parts of it, like how it's different, is like in Paricon, which I have to force myself to say, because the first time I read it as Pearcon, and that stuck in my head for years. So I have to absolutely force myself to say Paricon, as well as just the sort of bureaucratic nightmare that is. But just stuff like thinking that a 1 year lead time is acceptable for a pair of shoes.
It's just utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, and what I see in a lot of the planning literature is to come up with an analogy here. If you've heard what's described in sex education as fear-based sex education, so like different groups will the fear differently. So for like religious people, it's the fear of sin. For more sort of conventional, it's like the fear of pregnancy or STIs. In the feminist field, it's the fear of sexual violence. And, just this misery and fear just piles up and piles up. And by the end of it, you're wondering why you wanted to do this in the first place. And a lot of socialist planning literature is that. It's just these fears over and over again that the workers will be lazy and useless. Somebody will take too much, or somebody won't do their share, or the ruling class will come back, or a new ruling class will rise out of the working class. And just so much of the planning is just fear and trying to structure it in some ways to avoid these fears. By the end of it, it's like, oh God, why are we even doing this? And that's what I love so much about Vanguard method and its sort of related environs is this says, yes, we can do this. And won't it be amazing the things we can do?
Well, on that note, I think that's a great place to leave the conversation. Roger, thanks very much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.